Labour is against independence in Scotland, but this does seem to be yet another election all about independence. Doesn't Scotland need greater powers in order to fight its way out of COVID and manage its recovery?
Look, I think there's certainly more need for more devolution, and I think people in Liverpool, Birmingham, Manchester, Cardiff feel that just like they do in Glasgow, where I'm sitting, or other parts of Scotland, so we can have a recovery that works for everyone. But just on the first point, Jane, it's politicians that want to talk about independence in this election campaign. It's the Conservatives and the SNP who want to make this election campaign about which side you were on in a referendum in 2014. But in actual fact, COVID didn't choose between yes, no, leave and remain. The aftermath is not going to choose between yes, no, leave and remain. This is a pandemic election, not a normal election. And I think too many of the other political parties and other politicians forget that 10,000 of our fellow citizens have lost their lives. And what this election must be about, and that's what I'm focusing on, what the Labour Party is focusing on, and what the next Parliament has to be about, is that national recovery. So we can come through this most difficult year that it's been for all of us in our lifetime and actually build a stronger and fairer nation. And that's the case we'll be making in the last 11 days of this campaign and beyond.
Well, you maybe need to be speaking to some of your Labour candidates, because I've got a list here of ones that have got quotes on independence. And the problem seems to be that the line coming from the Labour Party is slightly confused and woolly. Dundee City West candidate Mercedes Villalba in favour of another referendum. Now, this is from just January. If we're not truly content with the status quo, hadn't we better call for a referendum to put our alternative to the people? Dundee East candidate Owen Wright, again, this January. I wouldn't go as far as being pro-independence and supporting yes being a requirement, but definitely being in favour of a second Indie ref would help bring back voters to the party. Lothian's candidate Nick Ward, again in January this year. I do not think that acknowledging the right to self-determination and accepting that if a majority in Parliament wants a second referendum is a silly position. So there are a lot of people who will say that the Labour Party doesn't have a consistent policy on this.
No, it does, Jane, because what people are talking about there is, of course, Scotland has a right to choose its own future. But what we are all united on in this election campaign, and our manifesto makes it clear, is that we do not support independence. We don't support a referendum. We believe the next Parliament should be focused entirely on delivering a national recovery and pulling our country back together, not going back to those old arguments, not going back to the old divisions. And that is a case that only Labour is making in a serious way in this election campaign. And all our candidates are unified on that.
But you might not support independence, but it does seem that quite a lot of your candidates support a referendum. Are you not worried that the very pro-unionist Labour Party voters are going to vote Conservative this time round?
No, not at all. The challenge you have, the clear fault line in our election and the clear fault line in Scottish politics is that we have 14 years of an SNP government, 7 years of Nicola Sturgeon First Minister, and in that time there have been catastrophic failures of government. And whenever there is a failure, the SNP either says it wouldn't have happened if we had independence, or worse still, what they say is it might have been bad, but look at that mob over there. At least we're not as bad as them, pointing at the Tories. Frankly, Scotland deserves better than that, and UK deserves better than that. And that's why this election campaign has got to be about the next 5 years and how we make what has been a really, really difficult year, how we come through it and make a fairer and stronger country. Not going back to those arguments. And that's been the central part of my leadership for 8 weeks in this job. It's a central part of my leadership for the last 2 weeks as we lead up to that election. And I give the cast iron guarantee to every single person watching this programme. What I'm putting forward is not a case for half of the country that agree with me on the Constitution. I'm making a case for all of Scotland because I want to come through this most difficult of years and have a recovery that works for everyone, no matter what the constitutional position.
On the subject of recovery, you have a national recovery plan, offers various things, promises various things, including 60,000 jobs for recovery, a lot of bold promises, but questions about how you would fund it. The IFS has had a look at your figures and said that you'd have to substantially increase Scottish taxes and would need to double the unallocated funding available to the Scottish Government this year to meet these manifesto promises. Are you not writing cheques that you can't cash?
Well, we dispute that because there is an overlap in terms of some of the spending commitments we have made. So some of the spending commitments we have made, we've allocated the full budget, but there are overlap in terms of smaller amounts of budget that the SNP have allocated, but we want to go further than them in terms of some projects. And I'll give you one practical example of that. We believe that there's going to be a jobs crisis coming through this pandemic. And I don't want us to wait till after the lockdown ends or after the virus finally disappears for us to start investing in that new jobs for the future. So we have published the most ambitious and largest job creation scheme in the history of the Scottish Parliament, not 60,000 jobs, 170,000 new jobs. And I'm not shy about the price tag. It will cost £1.2 billion. But we have billions of pounds of unallocated, recurring and non-recurring spend available to us in the Scottish budget. What are we waiting for? We need to be using that right now to plan for the recovery, start the recovery right now, so we do not have a lost generation coming through this pandemic.
Do you accept, though, that it will lead to tax rises in Scotland? You said during the Labour leadership campaign in Scotland that you'd bring forward more radical tax policies than Jeremy Corbyn. So who in Scotland is going to be paying more tax under you?
Well, we've made clear, I support a more progressive tax system, but I believe we can use the billions of pounds that are unallocated. Alongside that, I want to create a new tax in Scotland that targets those big online giants like Amazon, who have done such phenomenal success through these most difficult times in terms of their profits. Let's tax companies like Amazon appropriately. Let's use that money to invest in the high street, to invest in jobs, so we can.
What about individual taxpayers, though?
And then we have made a commitment that we will not look to increase personal taxation over the course of the Parliament. But if in the later part of the Parliament, if we do have a deficit that we need to meet with tax rises, we would only consider a tax rise in the first instance of those earning over £150,000 a year, and then those earning over £100,000 a year. But our presumption is against personal income taxes.
So you're confident that you can raise this 1.2 billion just for big business?
No, the 1.2 billion I think we already have. The 1.2 billion is already available to us in terms of our first year of spend. It's for the longer term, as we go into year 3, 4 and 5 of the Parliament, that I think we can have a substantial budget. But if we have a gap in our budget, only at that moment would we look at personal income tax rises for those at the very, very top.
Do you think you're tough enough to take on Nicola Sturgeon? A lot of people think that she's had a very good COVID outbreak and has done herself a lot of favours. If it comes down to it, can you take her on?
Absolutely, I can take her on, and I'm standing directly in her own constituency as a demonstration of that. But look, I don't want to take her on the way that previous politicians want to take people on, which is shouting at them, getting angry at them. I think our politics deserves better than that. I'm going to do it with honesty. I'm going to do it with humility. I'm going to do it with empathy. I'm going to do it with unity. And I want to spread hope across the country, because that's the way we get the Labour Party back on track. But more importantly, that's the way we rebuild the country we all love. Would
you be interested in forming another coalition with the Lib Dems?
No coalitions with anybody, but I'm happy to work with any individual political party or any individual on one-off issues. So, for example, I've worked with every single political party in the Parliament around tackling prejudice and hate in all its forms. My party worked with the SNP around the Period Products Bill and the Protection of Retail Workers Bill. I've worked with the Liberal Democrats to get a public inquiry into mental health services and more funding for mental health services. I've worked with the Greens around reversing the SQA exams fiasco from last year. So on individual issues, I'm happy to work with anyone, because if we can't come together at a time of national crisis, when can we come together? So that's the challenge I lay down to every other political party, is forget the divisions of the past, forget the old arguments, recognise that this is a pandemic election where 10,000 of our fellow citizens have lost their lives, and let our politics rise to the occasion. Let's give Scotland the government and the opposition it deserves, and let's give it the Parliament it deserves, so we can make the best out of what has been a really, really difficult situation.